Welcome to Future Talk. On today's program, we're going to talk about one of the last frontiers of science and one of the most difficult to study, the human brain itself. How does it work? Why does it sometimes not work the way we want it to? And how can we make it work better? My guest is Michael Merzenich, Professor Emeritus of Neuroscience at the University of California at San Francisco. Professor Merzenich has been a pioneer in brain science for almost 5 decades, and he's a leading figure in the new field of brain plasticity. He's made many contributions to the field, won numerous awards, and holds about 100 patents. He's also the founder and chief scientific officer of a company called Posit Science, which uses brain plasticity to develop new behavioral therapies. He's also the author of the recent book, Soft Wired: How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Can Change Your Life. Mike, welcome to the program.
It's nice to be with you, Marty.
Mike, what would you say are some of the most important developments in brain science today?
Well, certainly one overriding a new understanding is the fact that the brain is continuously plastic. That is to say, it's continually remodeling itself as a function of how we use it. So the fact that it is subject to constant change, you could say, and change in a positive or a negative direction as a function of how we engage it, is a critically important, adds critical important information about how we think about the brain changing now, in the face of disease or problems, or how we might change it to our benefit.
Now, is that a new idea? It seems sort of intuitive that the brain, as a living part of your body, can make adaptations.
Well, historically, this was a broadly held view, that the brain, in fact, must be remodeling itself across the course of a life. And then about 45, 50 years ago, scientists solidified on the idea that the brain basically became permanent, became hardwired relatively early in life. And beyond that point, it was the machinery was relatively rigidly established and was unalterable. Now we understand that every time you acquire an ability, or every time you improve an ability, you're actually revising the machinery of your brain. You're actually changing its operational characteristics.
Now, can you change the brain at will? Can you remold your brain, reprogram it? And are you changing at the subconscious level or the conscious level?
You can to some extent, and you can do this either mentally or by engagement in interactions with the world. You can engage the brain to change in purposeful ways, in all kinds of ways.
Now, you actually wrote a book on brain plasticity. In fact, it's sitting right here on the table. Maybe you could hold it up to the camera.
Sure.
Okay. Can we see the book? Okay, there it is, Soft Wired: How the New Science of Brain Plasticity Can Change Your Life. Now, is the book a theoretical book, or does it have some practical advice that people can actually use?
Well, it's full of practical advice, but it's based upon real science, and it's meant to be serious from the point of view of the science and the correct interpretation of our understanding of the brain. So it is scientific, but at the same time, it's meant to be readable and meant to provide a guide, advice to a person living a life to the advantage of their brain.
So are we talking about remodeling your brain so that you can have more effective behavior to accomplish what you want?
Of course. You know, it's all about making the most out of life. So everyone has the potential, you could say, to change their brain so that they're more powerful, more effective next month as opposed to this month. And they can do that, you could say, by changing the way or how they think about how they're leading their life, what they're doing in their life, in their everyday life, to the advantage of their brain. But they can also go to and use strategies that have evolved in this science by which they can exercise their brain in ways that we now know drive it in positive or corrective or improving directions.
Well, let's take one example. A lot of people have memory problems, especially as they get older.
Right.
Can the techniques that you talk about in the book help people get their memories working better?
They can. We've demonstrated this repeatedly. And there's a deeper understanding, or a deeper capacity to understand how to achieve this when you understand the underlying neurology. Because it's not just about practicing remembering. You don't lose your memory just because you fail to understand how to remember. It's memory is degraded because the way the brain is representing information that you're trying to record in permanent form is progressively degraded, for example, as you age. So it turns out that you can exercise your brain, you can train it in ways that refine, that sharpen, that increase the fidelity of that information again. And when you do that, you'll record it with greater facility.
So is it like you're exercising your brain the way you would exercise the body. You make the body stronger by exercise, and you make the brain stronger with mental exercises?
That's exactly right. And when you exercise the body, in a sense, you know what you must do with high efficiency to drive improvements that really matter to you and to your physical performance. So too with the brain. Increasingly, we understand how to engage it with high efficiency to drive changes that will really matter to you and that will generalize to real life.
Now, there are a lot of issues that people have regarding, personalities. Like some person might be very prone to anger, and he'll
Right.
say, I'm too quick to get angry,
Right.
and it always gets me in trouble. I would like to rewire my brain so I didn't have that response to that
Right.
stimulus.
Well, we now know that it's all plastic, and we all know that it all emerges. All of these, our strengths and weaknesses emerge, you could say, are evolve as a consequence of where we've been in life. And we all know that to a substantial extent, they're modifiable. So, for example, we have created in a laboratory setting very complex training strategies to revise the emotional brain, to advise the brain that's making judgments about social circumstance or about how we operate socially in the world. And we're trying to use this to help an individual who has a history, for example, is highly prone to violent behavior, the released criminal, the criminal that has a violent past, and so forth. So we now know with increasing understanding how to actually drive the brain in such an individual in an improving or corrective direction.
Some people go to psychiatrists for many years to try to resolve their problems
Right.
with barely noticeable improvement.
Right.
Could this ultimately replace psychiatry?
Well, it will certainly augment it. I mean, one of the problems we have in reducing this to practice from the point of view of using something like computer-guided exercise is that it's difficult to deal with all of the individual circumstances that relate to a history of a person that might lead to or contribute to the genesis of all of these distortions. And those have to be dealt with more idiosyncratically, more individually. But certainly, many of the distortions that arise in the brain as a consequence of such history or that account for such behavior can be addressed on some level by using these general powerful tools.
Is it somewhat analogous to computer programming? There's a bug in the program, so
Yeah.
you're going to debug it.
It is a little bit analogous to that, and increasingly what we're trying to do is to broadly survey what is right and wrong about the brain with the goal of trying to address those things specifically need help or repair.
Now, there's a few fairly simple exercises on your website, which
Right.
is Brain HQ. We have a couple of short videos about that. So we're going to start with a video called Easy Details.
Right.
What are we going to see in this video?
Well, we're just going to see a beginning level or an early level of an exercise in which we're trying to drive the brain. You could say we're defining the starting point in the performance of an individual, and we're going to try to drive the brain in an improving direction in a series of elemental faculties that relate to complex visual behavior and experience.
Okay, so let's go ahead and roll that video. Okay, so there's no soundtrack. So
Now we're beginning the exercise and we saw three flash stimuli. And the task is to identify the two stimuli that are paired, that are identical, and reconstruct their presentation order accurately. And you can see that the stimuli are substantially confusable. And you can see that the stimuli are occurring anywhere across the visual field. Now in such an exercise, you say, well, why would we exercise such an ability? What's the purpose of it? Well, first of all, we're trying to train an individual to make more refined distinctions about what they see. We're trying to train them to make those distinctions when these stimuli are presented in progressively briefer durations. What we're trying to do, in a sense, is to improve the accuracy and the speed of operation or processing in the brain. These are very elemental to many aspects of behavior. For example, we know that just the speed of operation in its variability in humankind accounts for about 50% of the variation in human intelligence. And then what you have to understand is that this is a level of this exercise that could begin on an easier level, depending upon your performance. The behavior would very quickly adjust to the level in which you get most of the answers right, but never all of them. And then what it's trying to do is to ratchet you up and up and up in your performance until ultimately you're performing a task like this at a very, very high level. Now what a high level means is that you're not just seeing these stimuli accurately locally at very fast, short duration of exposure right in front of your nose, but you're seeing them all across the field and correctly identifying their location, reconstructing their order. And you're doing this under circumstances in which the distinctions are very difficult. Seeing the details, for example, against the background are difficult.
So it's like a video game that has progressively more difficult levels to play, and you want to get the highest level.
It's like a video game, except it's constructed to drive neurological change with maximum efficiency. So basically what we're trying to do is to slowly but progressively and with high efficiency drive your abilities in these elemental facets of processing information from wherever you're at to a higher and higher and higher and higher level. And what we're trying to do is to drive you to the level, from the point of view of an elemental facility like this, series of facilities like this, to the level of an adept. The farther you are driven in this direction, the greater this will contribute to your ability to accurately record and interpret what you see under any circumstance in real life.
Now we have a second video which is similar in some ways to the first video.
Right.
What's different about the second video?
Well, what we're seeing here is just another level of the exercise, and we're going to see another level of the exercise in which you're seeing the same task, but now.
Okay, let's go ahead and show it.
But now you can see that there's a much more confusable. The stimuli are much more confusable, and they're against the background in which the distinction is more difficult.
Less contrast, harder
and
to see.
you can see also that the reconstruction of sequence now, you're commanded to reconstruct 3 against 2 foils, 2 non-stimuli. And this is a little bit more difficult. We've added what's called to what's called a cognitive load. This is more difficult to make these distinctions. Now this task on this level will become devilishly hard. Pretty soon the stimuli are across the screen from field to field. They're becoming very, very rapidly. And you'll have to resolve what you saw and identify the sequence order of seeing the right stimuli in order.
So this is about speed of processing.
At rocket speed. It's about speed of processing, and it's about accuracy in identifying what you see. Speed of processing is useless unless it's done with retained accuracy. So it's speed of processing with high accuracy. That's really what matters for the operations of your brain.
Now what about cognition? Understanding what you see, seeing patterns, seeing how things are like in real life. Does brain plasticity deal with that? Like I look at a scene and I understand what's going on,
Right.
a scene in real life.
Well, all of those patterns are constructed from their elemental parts. And you can see we exercise the brain as a very accurate perceptual receiver in all of its elemental parts. And if you do that in an appropriate way, those skills, those elemental skills, translate to accurate processing in real life. So, for example, if I train an individual at a task like this, we know that I can double the speed of a person that's, say, older, but 60-year-old, 70-year-old individual, in performing an everyday skill when they're timed at it. So now when you open the phone book and look up a phone, that's an antique skill, but if you were to do that, it would take you half as long. If you were searching in your medicine cabinet for your pills, it would take you half as long to find the right bottle. So you can demonstrate that in everyday tasks, this translates directly to personal benefit.
And I think you said in your book that you need to be more engaged with your brain in the sense of being more attentive to what you do. So for example, if you're exercising on the exercise bike, but you're reading a novel while you're doing it, you don't get as much benefit out of it as if you're paying attention to every bodily motion.
It's a key point, Marty. We now understand the conditions under which the brain permits change. And a simple way to think about it is it only permits change when it matters to it, and it only permits change when it itself determines that change is good for it. And put it another way, it's only when I'm engaged on a certain level in what I'm doing, it's only when I'm attending to it, it's only when it matters to me, it's only when I'm weighing the outcome and I'm judging the outcome to have been effective or successful on some level, that's when change occurs with greatest facility and power.
So it's not really about controlling the brain, but getting more in harmony with it and being in sync with it?
Yeah, and if you think about this, just with respect to how you lead your life and what you do in life and how you engage yourself or what your hobbies might be or how you think useful things you might do in life, think about that the value of engaging in activities that matter to you on a level and that have an aspect of continuous learning, which you can expect to drive continuous change.
Now you mentioned some things also that you wouldn't necessarily intuitively connect with brain plasticity, like improving your hearing, especially if you're in a crowded room and there are a
Right.
lot of people
No.
talking at the same time and you're trying to hear
Right.
one, how does brain plasticity help you in that situation?
Well, actually, we know now that we can train a person as a listener, and in that listening training, we sharpen their listening faculty, again, in the same sort of way we might think about sharpening your visual faculties in an elementary way. And when we do that, we know from scientific studies that that actually improves the power in which the brain represents the details of that orally received speech. And by so doing, basically you hear it with greater fidelity against a background of noise. And we also know, Marty, about the processes that control that continuously suppress all of those distracting things that are occurring in the environment. So I'm in a restaurant and somebody is clacking the silverware over here and somebody's moving over here. Well, if I'm focusing on you in conversation, we know the processes that actually control or suppress those distractors. So these two things together, amplifying the fidelity or the quality of what I'm hearing, thereby giving it dominance over the noisiness in the environment, and then suppressing all of those bizarre and unexpected things that are going to take me off the beam, both of those we know how to control by training.
And a younger person might suppress those other sounds without even being aware that they're doing it.
Right.
But as we get older, it becomes a little more difficult and takes a little more conscious effort.
Right, exactly. And once we understand these principles on some level, then we think about leading our life and about how we're controlling our attention or our focus in our engagement in whatever we're doing. We're going to be operationally more effective.
Now, what does it look like when we rewire our brains? Are there millions and millions of neurons that are reconnecting like a big switchboard?
Well, you're off by order of the magnitude. Yes, it's billions and billions of neurons.
Okay.
Well, if you consider it in detail, it's unbelievable what happens. I mean, if you engage an area of the cortex we know to change by engaging it intensively in a behavior, a large proportion of the neurons can change their relative strengths. And the connections between neurons can change their relative strengths. But more than that, all kinds of other things are changing in the machinery underneath it. So the level of change that's occurring boggles the imagination. But it's also incredibly complex. No one can unravel it in any real detail because it's so complicated.
Now, there's a question of consciousness here. Where does consciousness reside? We know collectively you have a consciousness, but is each individual neuron conscious? Does it make each connection consciously and deliberately, or just blindly obeying some chemical signal without knowing what it's doing?
Well, this is a subject of long study and debate, and almost every old neuroscientist I know of who is really thoughtful is trying to understand it on some level to satisfy themselves. What we do know is that it's the engagement of systems in their operations. When we see certain activity across systems, not in any one place, but the engagement of systems that we associate with the basic element of quality. I have this little moment of conscious experience or conscious thought. And when I come to a condition, when I'm not aware that something is in my presence, and suddenly I am aware, we can find that moment, and we say that it corresponds with an activity that's in a sense reverberating in the machinery of the brain. So we associate it with the existence and persistence of that reverberating activity. We kill it and we lose consciousness. We generate it and we have a conscious moment. So we think it's in the brain. Exactly how it accounts for the light, what exactly is the light, in the sense of how we think about it from our own mental perspective is beyond everyone's understanding.
Now, do we make any distinction between brain and mind? Are they synonymous? Or some people would say, well, the computer analogy, the brain is the hardware, the mind is the software.
Right.
You can study the brain all you want,
right,
but you won't understand anything about it until
right,
you understand the software.
Well, what we do know increasingly, and there's a large body of evidence for that, is when the brain operates in thought. For example, it operates in planning, or I'm trying to imagine through a progressive exercise, mental exercise, how I would improve at some ability. The brain changes using exactly the same processes that it changes if I'm engaging it, say, on machinery, or I'm changing it by learning something using a tool or an appliance or a Game Boy or something. In other words, the processes that are involved in our mental actions appear to be the same basic processes, the same machinery, operating in the same general way. has all of our actions and the control of all of our actions in whether it's controlling our body, not fundamentally different mechanistically from controlling our thoughts.
Now, is there anything you can do to make massive changes in your wiring? So, for example, if you set a new goal for yourself or you fall in love, and with that produce instant massive rewiring?
Well, my book is all about that because I'm trying to tell people that every one of us is subject to substantial revision. You know, the world is full of people that are unhappy with what they are, how they operate. And what you have to understand is that the brain is never done, you could say, as it's a machine that always has the promise of moving to a better or stronger direction. And we know many instances in history where people have had great transformations in their life, in the control of their behavior, in the control of their life, and in their possibilities. Coming from a weak platform to a strong platform is something that is always in our potential in all kinds of dimensions of our operational self.
Sometimes a deep religious experience will radically transform people.
Exactly. No, that's an example. Or a person might abandon religion and take up some other powerful, for them, powerful operational, enter some powerful operational, whatever. The transformation is something we all have within us. The power of transformation is something we carry around. And Marty, one of the things that is the most frustrating to me about people's understanding of the science is that we have this great gift. We have the gift to be a little better, moving in a positive direction every day of our life if we just understand that we have it and exploit it. Because in most lives, in most individuals, it remains grossly underexploited.
Now, what's preventing people from doing it? Do you think people say, well, it took me long enough to get to where I am now, I don't want to change anything because maybe I'll slip backwards?
Well, we have a strategy in a contemporary lifestyle that in which we have a period of life, our first 20, 30, 40 years, in which we're acquiring abilities that dominate us. We become, in a sense, we largely rest on our, I'm talking about the average human life. Many individuals among us continue to grow throughout their life, but others become relatively operationally stagnant by the time they're 25 or 30 or 35 or 40 years of age, and it's all downhill from there. If you look at the trajectory of the average individual, and just think about brain speed. How fast can I solve, how fast am I as a problem solver? How fast can I come up with an answer? Not too many old people are big winners on Jeopardy, right? They just can't come up with the answers fast enough. And the reason they can't come up with the answers fast enough is that brain speed progressively declines throughout life unless you do something about it. Well, it turns out it's a faculty that's easily improved by appropriate forms of exercise.
So if you do crossword puzzles and Sudoku puzzles and jigsaw puzzles, anything like that, that might help?
Marty, we use those as control tasks because they don't help very much. They help on one level. They help. It's always good to practice remembering and practice what's in your information stores. But they don't really get to the elemental problem, which is the brain, unless you exercise it, will deteriorate as a signal resolver. Better to be an aggressive bird watcher than a Sudoku puzzle solver.
So is there something you could recommend for the average person just to start being more conscious of their brain processes, maybe?
Well, first of all, I recommend maybe think about reading my book because it explains many of these things in I think, understandable scientific terms. And I think it represents a true, sort of the level first approximation, a true description of how your brain is operating, you could say, to your advantage, and what you need to do to advantage it.
And you also have a website which has some of your exercises. Yes. If somebody wants to go there, what's that website again?
That's BrainHQ, so www.brainhq.com. And you can go there and see what brain training exercises are like, at least in this form of them. And all of the exercises that are at this site, we know to be driving positive changes in the brain that would matter to you. So that's all. Everything that's on the site has been scientifically validated, and that's very important to us.
Are there any capabilities of the brain that we haven't even plumbed yet? For example, modern computers can communicate with each other by sending signals through the airwaves. Is it possible that maybe human brains could communicate directly without relying on the sensory organs?
Well, I was asked that question one time by a panel from the National Academy of Science, which I'm a member in service of the government. And they were interested in communication that you could say, for example, in the battlefield with a true wireless communication.
Telepathy would be nice.
But the answer is I don't know. You know, I think about the brain, and I've studied the brain and its physicality. I think about its operations in the flesh and blood of the living human brain, and or the living animal brain. So I understand the brain from this sort of physical perspective. And everything that I've needed to understand, you could say, is I can find within the dimensions of the skull. I don't need to go outside or explain. I have not found any need to explain anything that sits outside it in my own studies.
Now, does this mean that the capacity of the brain is finite? Like, how many gigabytes of memory storage do you have before your brain is filled up and you can't absorb any more information?
It's finite, certainly. But when you think about the connectivity of the brain, you know, not just billion, trillions of connections. You know, the wiring of the brain is you know, end to end can get to the moon and back. Incredibly complex machinery. It's incredibly adaptive. Void into any environment with almost any experience. It evolves a incredibly beautiful and elaborate construction of the world it happens to be born in and is operating in, and then learns to control its actions in it in a highly useful way. What a machine. Make one.
Do you think enough research is being done? Do you think it's getting the resources and funding necessary to drive it forward sufficiently?
Well, I think in a sense, there's enough of investment. You could say that research, like the brain itself, could always be more efficient. You know, if we knew how to make it more efficient. So just like we now know on some level how to make any brain operate with greater efficiency and power. So too, sometimes I wish the research apparatus could operate with greater efficiency and power. It's a messy process.
Anyway, I think we're going to have to wrap on that note because we are out of time, so I think that's sort of a good note to close on.
Right.
I'd like to thank my guest, Michael Merzenich, Professor Emeritus of Neuroscience at UCSF, author of the book, Soft Wired. Mike, thanks for being here.
It's been great fun to be with you, Marty.
Thank you for watching. Visit our website, www.futuretalk.net. For Future Talk, I'm Marty Wasserman, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you.